later. So if you want, we're going to post information on CCB as well so that you can go back and record this. You can send the link to friends, family, and other places. We're really excited about what we're doing here. This is something that's been on my heart for several years as far as trying to present something about God and his emotions. So we're really excited about what it has. And at the end of the time today, we're going to post Susan and our email addresses. You can also forward us any questions you have about the material if we run out of time and you've got to leave. But you want to send us some questions, find us on CCB, you can as well. But we love questions. We might even incorporate answering some of those questions in the coming weeks as we go through these different experiences.
So, why are we here? Why are we here, and what is the goal of this study? Simply put, we are flooded with the notion that emotions are bad or something that we shouldn't express or have. They should not be used because this makes us strong in the eyes of others, right? We're stronger if we don't have emotions, if we stay tough. Having and showing emotions can make us weak. This is a giant misconception we have found that needs to be overcome. It begins with what we have learned about emotions. So emotions are generally viewed as something to avoid. Only one emotion is acceptable, and that's usually happy. Hey, how are you doing? I'm great. I'm fine. I'm good. You really don't ever get, well, I've really had this really horrible day, and I'm starting to walk more towards my car, right? So we don't want the real answer. So the only one we really look for is happy. This has created an inability to understand and recognize our emotions, so we default to what is acceptable. Like we can never be afraid or we can never be sad. We just kind of be who we're supposed to be. And there's also this expectation of emotionalness in society, like men versus women. Men aren't supposed to be emotional because well, not me, but because they're men.
Right,
but
we don't do that.
Right, they say unemotional, but then all of a sudden we're like, but what's going on? Why aren't you talking to me? So which way do we want it to go? Women, we're allowed to be emotional, but sometimes we get a little too emotional, some people tell us, right? So there's the whole stereotype between men and women, but of course we have twins, and honestly, it's the opposite for them.
We're like a psychological study in our house. So
when it comes to
we've got a boy and girl twins. They'll be 15 on Monday, which is crazy and exciting.
Mm-hmm. So this brings us to a paradox of emotions. We call it a paradox. Our society has a paradoxical relationship with emotions. It's paradoxical. It's valued and it's hated. So they can be valued, but they're also hated at the same time. They are hated so much that we will do whatever we can to avoid them because that's what's going to make us strong, because we need to be strong. We define individuals without emotion as strong. I put Steffi Graf up here. I grew up playing tennis. When I think of someone who is tough and brave, and I had a picture of her on my refrigerator because I played tennis in college, I needed to be just like her because she was tough, because she went out and played tennis even when her family was falling apart. She won Wimbledon in the middle of this horrible time when her dad went to prison, and she showed no emotion. And I was like, that's who I'm going to be because she is amazing. She's German.
She's German.
Maybe that was a little easier. I don't know, but it was just straight up, she was tough. And then on the flip side of that, we've also got sharing emotion and vulnerability shows strength, and all these Facebook testimonials, or you see on Twitter, or you see in any kind of social media, or even the newspaper or magazines. It's like, oh, they are so brave to talk about themselves. Turn the page. And then it's like, why can't I be like that? But wait, we can't show our emotions. So it is a paradox. So we see what we could be, but we aren't quite there. So actually, emotions start early.
Right. When we think of children with emotions, and we automatically begin to put emotion and label them, right? Look at the happy baby, right? It's just a baby. There's no real feelings there yet. Oh, he's crying. He must be sad. There's something we ought to do. There's not a sadness part for emotion. So we start to attribute emotions when there aren't there yet, right? This is the baby's first smile. It's actually, research shows it's just mimicking behavior. That is not a baby going, wow, that was a great joke, Dad. Tell me another. That's not what's happening. So it's their first smile. But those emotions are so pure, they're the best. So when I was thinking about emotions, I had to think about one of my absolute favorite stories about my daughter, Isabel. When we moved to Lubbock when our kids were about 2.5. And when they, about a year later, they're 3.5, we, for some reason, were in a situation where we only had one vehicle.
Well, it's because we were poor.
Yeah, we were poor. We worked for the state, right? So we had one vehicle. So Susan had the ominous task of trying to ready two children, 3-year-olds, to take me to work in the morning and then pack them back up in the car and then pick me up. So this is October time, and Isabel was looking forward to getting a pumpkin. She was so excited about having a pumpkin, and she drove by this Presbyterian church on Indiana Avenue that had a pumpkin patch, and she drove by it 4 times a day. Once there, going back in the morning, once there, going back in the afternoon. This girl was getting really excited. So it was finally our time to go visit this pumpkin patch. So they pick me up from work, and we drive over there, and I park in the parking lot, and boom, both kids explode out of their car seats. And I'm like, okay, guys, calm down, hang on. Your mom and I got to get our stuff, wallet, keys, camera, because we got to take pictures. So Isabel is behind Susan, behind the passenger seat, and she's standing between her car seat and the back of the seat with a firm grip right on the passenger seat. And she begins to sway. And she's sitting there swaying, and that swaying and rocking turns into bouncing, and the bouncing turns into jumping. And then she exclaims for the whole car, I am so excited right now. It is the most pure amount of joy I have ever, and to date, seen in my daughter. And thank goodness there's not other reasons she's that joyful. But it was so wonderful to see that kind of joy for a pumpkin. I haven't ever been excited about a pumpkin, ever. I don't think Cinderella was excited about a pumpkin, but this girl was so excited about a pumpkin. And it was the most wonderful thing to see. And I'm sure since that point, I have been driving emotions away from her, because that's what we do. We then begin to teach children not to feel. When you see a small child and they're falling down and they're crying, what do we tell them? You're okay, don't cry. Your child comes in the middle of the night because they're scared. What do we tell them? Don't be afraid.
There's nothing to be afraid of.
There's nothing to be afraid of. Go back to bed. Right? So as much as we are attributing so much emotion to children, we're also driving this emotion out of them. So emotions start early, but that's also when the confusion starts.
Right. So confusion starts early. We're taught that emotions can't be used to guide our decision making. In fact, we're told not to use them to guide our decision making. A big fear is having too much emotion. If I become overly sad or fearful, then maybe there's a problem with me. The whole concept of emotions has created this problem-oriented that's a negative force in our lives. Of course, none of this is true, but what about don't wear your heart on your sleeve? Too much emotion is a bad thing. So we have a private practice, and we kind of talked about that a little bit a few moments ago, and some of y'all might know that, might not, and I just started counseling again because the kids are grown up and I have room in my head to do counseling now, and I love it. And Brian's a psychologist, and we work together. And weekly, I mean, it has really become weekly in almost all of our clients. And daily, we talk about what is the one thing that you're working on with them? What's the one thing you're missing? Well, they're missing the ability to recognize and share emotions and feel with their spouses. Like they're not able to connect and find those emotions and how to talk to one another. So it's like they can't share and feel with their spouse or with their parents or with their children, friends, and friends during times of sadness or what we would define as vulnerable and weak moments, possibly. So most of them are just like us. I mean, we're all basically functioning. We're all out in society, going to church, dinners, events. None of that right now currently for the past month and the future months. But basically, this is how we've been functioning, right? So except for now, which we're all doing a good job trying. But we all relate fine, right? We all go to church. We all talk to one another. We all get along. But we all seem to lack the ability to share our feelings with one another and grow closer because of sharing those feelings. It's scary. So where did all these ideas about emotion come from? Like, who taught us this? Like, who taught us to be like not emotional, to be emotional, to I loved my brothers. I grew up with two older brothers, but I always got this, wow, you sound just like a girl. And I'm like, well, but I am a girl. Like, why can't I sound like that? Well, that's just a whole lot of feelings going on I don't want to talk about right now. And I'm like, oh, okay, so I should not act like that. So where does this all come from? But we can also look back on generations. And if we think about, like, we have actually quite a few clients that had parents from the World War II, from that generation. And well, they came home, they didn't want to talk about it. That was too emotional. They didn't know how to deal with it. Vietnam, Korea, a lot of that big shift was, we can't handle those emotions. So let's just function, go to work, you go to school, you take care of the house, and then we'll just keep going. Well, then the baby boomers come, let's think about them. They don't want to be anything like their parents. So then they just go and be completely opposite. And then talk about our generation now. Well, no one is allowed to be sad. Every single child has to be happy all the time and involved in something and doing really great and being very successful and always getting a trophy. So nobody can go without anything. So we've kind of bounced back and forth. So basically, we're learning from each other kind of how to have emotions. So where does this leave us? Emotionless. It leaves us emotionless. So where do we go from here?
Well, we've got to go to God. And that's
Right.
kind of the point. That is the entire point of what we're doing here, is to highlight God as the better teacher of emotion. We are looking too much at ourselves and other people to try and determine by what's been done before, or this is how it is, instead of trying to actually learn what God has taught us about how to be emotional.
Right.
When I hear that, though, sometimes I get a little nervous, because then I hear these kinds of statements. If you are sad, then you haven't prayed enough. Or there is nothing to be afraid of if you have enough faith. If you are feeling anything but happiness, then you need Jesus. Oh boy, do these kinds of statements get me fired up, because they're taking emotion and they're putting that emotion with God, and not the way that God ever talks about emotion. It's misleading. It's so misleading, because that's not what God says about emotion. The other part of that is it is completely dismissive. So somebody comes up to you and tells you that they're sad, and you just say, you should pray for it, and then walks away from you. That's not really helping anyone deal with what's really going on. We're using the wrong role models, and we have to start using God, because maybe we're not the best teachers. Because God is an emotional God.
That's pretty cool, wasn't it? Did y'all like that?
I spent a lot of time trying to
We
figure
like
out
that one.
that animation there.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right.
Because he is such an emotional God.
I think the better thing is trying to figure out, what do we do when we're sad? How do we pray to God when we're sad? How do we encourage our faith when we are feeling afraid?
Right.
In what ways, if I'm scared, unhappy, feeling worthless or useless, how then do I tap into Jesus in my heart?
Right. We need to stop looking horizontal. We've kind of said this before. Actually, we did a lot of this talk in the marriage retreat, and this is just kind of how we think about it, is you can't look horizontal anymore. You can't look at your role models next to you. I mean, I can't look at Brian to figure out how to be emotional and connect. We have to learn how to do it together. And that's kind of what marriage is about. 16 years later, still working on doing that together. So we can't look horizontal to those around us to figure out how to be emotional. We have to start looking vertical. So we need to look to our emotional God to learn how we're supposed to be emotional. So what to expect? So go ahead.
No.
All right.
No.
So for the next 7 weeks, not including tonight is 8. So for the next 8 weeks, this is going to be our focus. We're going to gain a new understanding of how to be emotional in a godly way by studying God as an emotional being throughout the Bible, not other people. but God and those that he connects with through his emotions. And then hopefully we can come to understand how we can use emotion more effectively in our relationships with God and others. So remember, it's not just we're looking to God and how he's an emotional person, or an emotional being, but how we can be emotional with him. And then that relationship growing. And then also, first we get emotional with God. And then second, we become emotional with others as God does with us, or as he does with you.
So we have a couple of rules for the class for everybody, because everybody likes rules, like stay at home. That's one good rule. But we're going to go with, please interrupt and ask questions, right? The best way for us to make sure we're not passing you up and making sure that you understand is for you to interrupt. The more you ask questions, the more you're going to learn. It's the biggest thing you can do, and I'm trying to teach my 15-year-olds, when you get to college, you got to ask questions. So ask questions, that's how you're going to learn. Please add to the discussion, because it helps us make sure that we're covering the things that need to be covered as well.
Right.
But also then take this stuff you're learning this week and go practice it at home. And it isn't just, find big hard emotions. It's dealing with the hard stuff, some of the easy stuff, like, oh my gosh, traffic. We can think of quite a few emotions when it just comes to traffic. So we have to start practicing how we share and use and understand these emotions.
And actually, this is I'm just going to put this in here because, we do have a pandemic going on, and just the different emotions that go on because of it. It's been amazing that the majority of our clients, I have one client who talked about, well, it's been going on about a month. I've been feeling this way. And I'm like, do you think it has anything to do with the pandemic and just being scared of being, and a lot of people we had to work with to figure out those are connected. I took my kids to Sonic the other day. I don't think that was a great idea. I wasn't happy about it. I didn't want to go. I don't ever want to go to Sonic, but I say yes too much anyway with Sonic. But we get there and I'm just mad, and they kind of know I'm mad. And I'm like, well, do you want to go here? They're just going to hand you everything. We don't have any sanitizer. I'm just going through these little things in my head, and I'm not actually worried, by the way. So I haven't been scared. So I'm not reacting like that at any other time, but I just had a moment because it had just kind of welled up in me, and that I want to protect my kids, but they want to go to Sonic. And so I sat there for a little while after we drove off. I didn't say anything, and my son just kind of spoke up, and he's like, I could tell he was nervous because I think they're scared of me. But he said, so why'd you get mad? And I said, and I sat there for a moment because we've practiced this kind of stuff. And I go, because I'm scared. I go, I just got scared. I go, so I got frustrated at you. I got mad at you. And I, as he said, shamed him for getting Sonic. And I apologized. But I said, sometimes I'm just a little scared. And so I think there's a lot of emotion on the surface right now with people. So just thinking about it and just knowing it's there and putting a name to it might help. All right, so we're going to move on.
What we're going to cover right now are three important facets that we're going to talk about the rest of our time. And it's understanding a couple of basic tenets about God and his emotions.
So God's emotions exist and are righteous. In the beginning, two things happened. Do we remember where in the beginning happened? Has everybody got that? We know in the beginning was in Genesis, of course, but it's also in John, in the beginning. Right. So in the beginning, God created and was pleased. And then when God created, he made man after his own image. Those two are important to think about as we go through God and emotions and how we all connect to that. So early on, we get the idea that God is satisfied and happy with his actions. What are other words for happy? That's a feeling. So that's an emotion. He's excited. He's joyful. He feels pretty good with what he did. So he feels good about himself. This is not in a prideful way, but maybe a joyful way. So he feels joy. He has joy for what he's created. So we get an idea that God is an emotional being from the very beginning, which means that he has always been emotional. God was emotional from the very beginning. The problem is that the fruit of the tree of knowledge has created an opportunity for us to stop looking vertical, and it got us connected and looking horizontal. So the horizontal point of view only keeps us away from God, right? And his initial emotions when he created the earth, which was with joy, he created the earth. God's emotions are detailed throughout the Bible, from joy to anger to sadness to shame. They're all in there. When we think of God, we can think about some basic emotions. And you see up on your screen, we've got Genesis 3:14, which I'm just pulling from the verses. We put them up there if you want to look them up later and read the whole thing. But cursed are you above all livestock, Genesis 3:14. And then Deuteronomy 6:15, for the Lord your God is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you. I just finished reading the Bible. Finally, I'm 4 months late compared to Brian. He finished before me. Just finished through all the Chronicles. There's a whole lot of anger in there, and there's a whole lot of kings messing up. So yeah, there's some burning going on. Sad, another one. Jesus wept, my favorite, which we'll talk about a little bit later, which is John 11:35. And then fear. Father, if you are willing, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. Like, just knowing he had fear, just and being able to talk about it, you connect with him. And then love, of course. Love is all over the Bible, Old Testament and New Testament. For the Father loves the Son and shows him all he does. Yes, and he will show him even greater works than these, so that you will be amazed. John 5:20. So remember, God's emotions are also righteous. God's emotions exist and they are righteous. I'm mentioning this because everything that God does is righteous. So God is emotional, right? Emotions are godly because they come from God, his joy and his anger. He also made us in his image. So he made us in his image. Therefore, we are to be emotional as well. That's who we're supposed to be. We are not righteous, of course. What are we? Sinners. We are sinners. And sin interferes with our emotions, right? Just the sin and emotion aren't the same thing. But being emotional is not sinful. So remember, again, looking vertical, not horizontal, for how to be emotional, because it's what we do with the emotions that can create the sin. But we're supposed to be emotional. That's what God tells us. That's what God is. And that's what we're supposed to be. So they exist and they are righteous.
So God's emotions exist and are righteous, but God's emotions connect us to him and to others. Generally, people try and connect through stories. In my family, we are storytellers. So I love a good story. Stories are great, and they are certainly a part of our history, but they do not help us connect. The way that people connect is through emotion. Not everyone can know what it is like to live with an alcoholic, to win the lottery, to lose a child, to win a road race, to survive a sexual assault, to get straight A's on a report card, to be allergic to dogs, or to retire from a job you love. I don't even know that I can relate to many of, if any of those. But what I can relate to is some of the different emotions that are probably and likely involved with all of those things. The emotion is what connects. When we talk about emotions that are involved with these events, this is where the experience and connection takes place. When I was at Texas Tech University Student Counseling Center, I was in charge of forming and helping their group therapy program. And they had not been very successful with their group therapy program. They had one group, just one. It was the social shyness group. I don't know how they have even met. But when I came, I had a lot of love for group therapy and a great plan for how to get a group program going. And that was to have a general therapy groups offered. When we have general therapy groups, there's a lot of people that can come.
What does that mean, though? It's general.
So anybody who comes to the general therapy group means that any presenting problem could be there. Any presenting problem, eating disorders, sexual assaults, depression, anxiety, family, boyfriend, girlfriend, whatever it is, all in the same room because we all have similar emotions. That's how we connect. So the goal was to try and get no specific groups and mostly general groups, and we walked away with the opposite, and that's another story that Brian's fury came out later. But the idea here is that what works is when we do more, when we connect emotionally, not based on what we've experienced historically.
So we can all have different stories. We can all have different testimonials. But what do you connect with when you hear those testimonials and stories? You connect with the emotion. That's what you want to hear. But if you don't continue and connect through that emotion, then you just kind of turn the page, or I guess scroll up or down or whatever you do, and just kind of forget that that happened, and you don't really remember who that was or why it happened. So
God expresses his emotions so that we can connect with him. When, there, you moved it for me. He does it so often with us throughout the Bible. His emotions start at the beginning and they go all the way throughout. They are constant. It is his attempt to connect to us through the Bible. He connects to us emotionally in our hearts, and he uses the Holy Spirit often in order for us to connect in an emotional way. To understand God's pain is to understand his pleasure is to understand God. To understand your spouse's pain, to understand a friend's pain, is to understand your spouse. It's to understand your friend. Emotions are the way that we can have such an intimate connection with God and with one another. Oops, wrong button. The point is to try and have a heart-to-heart connection, right? A heart-to-heart. This is not, I spelled it wrong, because that's heart-to-heart with Max, the butler who helped Stephanie Powers.
Ever, right?
Right, anybody remembers that?
Great TV.
There was a dog, and Robert Wagner, man, he's handsome. That's what emotions are for. It's God's heart talking to our heart. When we have heart-to-heart communications, this is where people connect. When I want to have a heart-to-heart with somebody, I'm wanting to get closer to that person. This is what God is trying to do with us. He's trying to touch our hearts by giving us an insight into his own. God is also looking for people after his own heart.
So who does that make you think of? Shout it out. We won't hear it, or you can hear it. David, right? Good, Kelly. So a man after God's own heart, right? That's who we want to be. That's who he wants. That's who he wants us to be. David is introduced as someone as caring and obedient and strong and compassionate, right? How do we know David in this way? How do we know he's like this? Because I just read about a whole bunch of kings, and I don't remember thinking that way about most of them. Some of them hung in there for a little bit, but then just crashed and burned, which I guess, like, literally. But so David, throughout the Psalms, think about the Psalms. Think about how he talked in the Bible. I remember hearing David's emotions and his feelings and his sadness and his anger. And it's like he went through everything. He poured his heart out. And so I think that's why he's a man after God's own heart. He did murder. He did commit adultery. He did a lot of horrible things, but he still worked really hard to connect and become emotional with God. And that's who God wants us to be, emotional. And that is what connects us with him. So David is I also know that Paul, it said that, I remember reading it about Paul. Does anybody, yes, no, yes? Like, I remember someone saying that. I thought Jesus said it about Paul. Did they say that? Kelly sort of, I don't know if y'all remember. I do. I don't know if it's devotional or the Bible, but I'm going to go back and find it. But I looked and I couldn't find it. Did you do that?
No.
I didn't do that. You're writing all over the screen. Do y'all see that? I don't know why that's doing that.
Who is?
I don't know.
Not me.
All right, so let's go ahead and move on. So David is where we stopped, a man after God's own heart. Do y'all see the writing on the screen, the little blue marks? I don't know what that is. All right, so you want to do next? God's emotions role model his expectations of us. I'll let it sink in. God's emotions role model his expectations for us, right? So that's kind of what Brian and I did this week while we were working on this one. We were sitting in our room and kind of staring at each other, and I spoke that out and I go, God's emotions role model his expectations for us. How do we kind of start talking about that? We're just kind of staring at each other. And then our son walks in, James, and he comes in, and I looked at our son and I said, And I said to him, I go, what does it mean when God's emotions role model his expectations of us? And he just simply looked at both of us and he said, how he feels is how he wants us to act. I'm like, oh, that's pretty good.
Right.
So we kind of wanted to include that because we were pretty impressed with him. And we're like, and that's kind of what got the ball rolling for us. It couldn't be more clear or simple. Basically, God leads by example, right? The fact that these emotions exist is not enough. We must do what he does by using them. God expresses emotions with Moses and Joshua and Samuel and David and the Israelites throughout the Old Testament. He's emotional. Jesus uses his emotions with all of us, the people, his apostles, the lame, the rich, the Pharisees, and the Gentiles. God's expectation is for us to be emotional. We keep saying that, but I think it's important to keep saying. Let's go back to one of the verses I mentioned. Jesus wept. What does this verse tell you about Jesus? He was sad, right? He was sad. More than that, God allowed him to be sad and to express his sadness to his friends. Jesus was weeping for his friends, himself, and for Lazarus. Also important is to put it into context. I grew up hearing Jesus wept, and I was always like, well, why? Like, it's Jesus. Like, as a kid, I would just kind of think that. And I just hearing Jesus wept didn't quite connect me to him as a young person. It kind of made me a little confused because I was like, well, I don't want him to cry. I need him to be Jesus. Like, but he wept because he was sad and he expressed it. And so even though Lazarus was going to come back to life, which he knew, he was still sad because he felt emotion for his friends and he felt emotion for what was going on. And he also knew he was the one who said, I know, I'll be there when it's time. So he knew that he was doing that. And I'm sure there were other reasons, but so why be sad? Because being sad is godly and it helps him connect. What if Jesus wasn't sad? Kind of think about that for a moment. What if, Martha comes up, she runs up to the gate because she's not waiting. She's mad. She's running up to the gate before he even gets into town. She knows where he comes in the door, in the gate, or the gate, I guess, town. What if he just threw his hands up at Martha and said, woman, give it time. Just go back to what you're doing. It'll work itself out. That's not Jesus. Like, I think we wouldn't think of him the same way because he was emotional and he connected with everybody around him. He knew he was going to be okay. But he was sad and he wanted us to understand, and God role modeled that through him. So the important part of this verse is not that it fits into your Bible trivia games, by the way, as the shortest verse in the Bible. It's the shortest verse in the Bible because it's all that was needed at the moment. It didn't need anything else. We just needed to know that he wept.
So now we're going to transition. This is partly my favorite part. So buckle up here. We've gotten 3 parts of God that are important to understand his emotions. God's emotions exist and are righteous. His emotions connect us to him and to others. And then God's emotions role model his expectations of us. So now what we're going to be doing is a little bit of emotional terminology. So this is going to be fun because I like to talk about emotions because it's what I do all day. And so we're going to get into a couple of things, some things that are important as we move forward in helping you understand your own emotions, but also how God works with us through terms that we are using all the time when we talk about emotions, right? I'm a big believer that you don't say I feel unless you are about to say an emotion word. I have a client that goes, I feel like this is getting tiresome. I'm like it's getting tiresome is not an emotion. So
like everybody's over here.
So here we go. Empathy versus sympathy. These 2 words are not the same, and yet they tend to be used interchangeably. I hear more than I want to these 2 words misused and erroneously defined. Even worse, people conjugate them improperly. It's sympathetic and empathic, not empathetic. That sounds terrible. So
there's what our
right. So we need
camera.
some clarification.
Got a name and her name right there. Unlike
some people are trying to. Are you asking a question?
Hello?
Oh, nope. Okay.
No, okay.
More importantly, sometimes empathy and sympathy are forms of connecting with our emotions. And sometimes, if you like to think of cars and trucks as emotions, well, then think of the highway and road as empathy and sympathy. They're similar, but they're not the same thing.
They're basically what you do with the emotions that are expressed to you.
Right. Some people will state that empathy is defined as someone who listens really well. Some people will say sympathy means they're the kind of person that just gives advice. Again, those are not parts of the definition. The definition of sympathy is here: an affinity, an association, or relationship between persons or things wherein whatever affects one similarly affects the other. What this means, in my own words, is that basically we have to take away the similarly affects the other part. Having sympathy is a shared experience of emotions that are taking place. This means that if you are sympathetic towards someone or their situation, then you are experiencing the same feeling at the same time. Now, here's the definition of empathy. This one's long and verbose, so I'm going to leave it up there a little bit. I'm going to read it, and we'll get to some important parts here about it. The action of understanding, being aware of, being sensitive to, and vicariously experiencing the feelings, thoughts, and experiences of another, of either the past or present, without having the feelings, thoughts, and experiences communicated in an objectively explicit manner. Okay. That totally bothered me. So, what that means is basically, it's the idea of putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So I wear a size 11, Susan wears a size 8.5 women's. That does not mean that I can fit my feet in there, because I have to understand what it's like to be in her shoes, even though she's not telling me. And ladies' shoes are so uncomfortable, I hear. Well, at least. Anyways, so Carl Rogers, an early influence on psychology and theory, has also defined empathy in his seminal work, On Becoming a Person. Yes, that is the name of his book, On Becoming a Person. And he defines empathic understanding as sensing the feelings, the personal meanings of people in each moment, perceiving these from the inside as they seem to others, and then successfully communicating this understanding without losing the separateness of his own identity. The key words there are that I hear are understanding, perceiving, communicating, and separate. So let's talk about an example real quick.
All right, so I get to do the example. Yay. The example is, if you are drowning in a lake, which do you want? Do you want sympathy or do you want empathy?
So this would be the time to turn your mics off and give us an answer if you have one. If you're drowning in a lake, which do you want? Sympathy or empathy?
One is sympathy, two is empathy. One or two? Two, empathy.
Two.
I think Sid wants sympathy. Sympathy and empathy.
What was Sean's answer? What was Sean's answer there?
Two. What did you want, Sean?
He wants
He
two.
wants two, and I think Emily wants one.
What's the difference? Somebody who's got a mic on. What's the difference? What would sympathy look like if you're drowning in a lake?
I think somebody would save you.
Not quite.
Sympathy.
Not sympathy.
Ah, 50-50, yes.
Thank you for speaking up.
Thanks for trying. Empathy, right, is putting yourself in someone else's shoes. So empathy is going to be seeing someone drowning in a lake, and empathy would be someone on the shore going, wow, that looks really uncomfortable. I'm going to see what I can do about it. Reach, throw, row, go, right? That's the Boy Scout way. So empathy is someone who's not experiencing that same feeling, but can understand what someone might be going through and stay separate from what they're experiencing. So now what would sympathy look like then?
Anybody want to guess?
Shared experience.
So they'd be drowning too.
Yeah,
Right. They're drowning right
exactly.
next to you. Ah!
Yep, they just
So-
jump in and drown with them.
Right.
Like, I'm going to drown with you because they don't want them to be alone, but they're not, we don't want that. So in this case, it's a very obvious empathy is better than sympathy, but that doesn't mean sympathy is bad. Sympathy is important. We do want sympathy. So it's important to ask now, is God sympathetic or is God empathic? Or both?
Any guesses?
Empathic.
Empathic.
Redeemed, Sid Walker.
Yes, God is empathic, right?
Yeah.
He is definitely empathic. He is separate from us. He is God.
Mhm.
He is understanding and perceiving and communicating. Those are the basic words for empathy. Understanding, perceiving, communicating, and separate from us.
But I think it's really important to think about, because empathy is, some people, empathy is easy and it comes natural. I have friends who are, I don't have a lot of friends, but the one that I have one who's very empathic, and it's just, I love to sit down and tell her stuff because she just knows how to allow you to move through what you're doing. I am not naturally empathic. I walk away going, oh my gosh, I forgot to ask how they were doing. And I feel, and that's, I have to work at it, and I'm just not as good at it. That doesn't mean I'm not nice. It just means I'm not as good at being empathic. So each person's different with it, but both are important. So
again, can God be sympathetic? Does God have a shared experience of our emotions? Absolutely.
Sure, through Jesus.
Absolutely,
Yes,
right.
yeah.
Jesus came down, God eliminated the separateness and came and became man and joined us. So now we're going to talk about that.
All right. So sympathy and empathy are ways of describing the connection. They are not actual feelings. Am I going to repeat? No.
Yeah, go ahead.
They are not actual feelings. In the Old Testament and the New Testament, we see a lot of empathy from God. He is separate from us as a people, and he is God. He understands our struggle, and he offers support, compassion, and healing. God in the Old Testament struggles, I think, with the lack of reciprocal empathy. Like the Old Testament, you really don't see God, David and Elijah, and I think of some of the ones that I love to, that's why, because you did see them, they wanted to come back and talk to God and somehow be empathic. Does God need that? No, we need it.
Right.
He needs it because we need it. He wants us to have it. So he is trying to connect, and time and time and time again, we fail. So when Jesus comes, we have, in the New Testament, he perceives our struggles, and it is still the Son of God.
So there's still a separateness. Like Jesus has empathy toward people because he still separates himself as being the Son of God.
Right. So when Jesus comes, we have a new opportunity to connect. Sympathy, like Sid had mentioned. This is when sympathy is good. But by the way, I would drown with Jesus anytime. I have no problem jumping in to whatever lake or river or anything if Jesus is in there. Just have a good time. I would. Psalm 23, though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death.
I shall fear no evil, for he is with me.
Right. So yes, you can walk through. We have a shared understanding of suffering. When we see his suffering, we feel all of our pain and know that he has that same feeling, Jesus we're talking about, at the same time, in the same place. I don't know what it's like to be crucified, but I do know that he knows what it's like for me to go through everything that I go through, right? So that was the purpose. Jesus is the way God states his understanding of our feelings, that he shares in our pain and he praises in our joy. I think of the worship song, I Am Not Alone. I believe this because Jesus is in my heart. I am not alone. I'm never going to be alone. And honestly, I'll just say this. When Brian and I first met, we went running. The one thing he said is he says, I want to be a psychologist because I want to teach kids that they are never alone and they have Jesus in their heart. Like that was it was the sweetest thing, because
That wasn't a line.
it really wasn't a line. I mean, I still didn't want to date him at the time, but I mean, I did eventually. But it was just, it just kind of was this aha of like, but you're not, you're never alone. Once you have Jesus, you are always with him. You aren't by yourself. So this,
I used to think that sympathy was an unsophisticated, terrible way of trying to describe a way of connecting. I thought that the sympathy card section in Hallmark was mislabeled. Like, that's truly empathy. Hey, I know what you're going through. Sorry, right? Sorry you're going through. That's empathy. That's not sympathy. So, but when I think about the idea that God, Jesus, is sympathetic to me, when I am experiencing any sort of sadness, heartache, fear, and know that Jesus is experiencing that fear with me, that is incredibly comforting.
so God shares our emotions with us. I used to, I think you already said that. All right. All right. So two more short areas that we're going to cover.
We're
So hang in
almost there. So the next word we want to cover is compassion. Compassion is different than sympathy and empathy, right? The idea of having emotions is to have your emotion is who you are and what happens. And so we're trying to learn that we need to be more than not be, but compassion is the to be and do. The difference between compassion and empathy, sympathy, is that it is coupled with the desire to alleviate the distress. Basically, compassion equals empathy plus action. So compassion is what God has all of the time. Compassion is the do that comes after we begin to feel. Now, we have a couple of verses and we're running.
I'm sorry.
God is compassionate all of the time. It is the thing that he is constantly having with and for us. So I have a few verses. I'm not going to go into as much detail because I want to try and get through everything and leave some time for questions if people have them. But I guess one of my favorites here is Jonah, and he uses compassion as he's preaching to finally gets out of the giant fish and gets to his calling. And let everyone call urgently upon God. Let them give up their ways and their violence. Who knows? God may relent and with compassion turn from his fierce anger so that we will not perish. Jonah must be some great preacher because every single person in Nineveh changed their minds, right? So the God has compassion all of the time.
Right.
It's used all of the time throughout the Bible. Jesus had compassion. But one we want to highlight is, and Susan's going to talk about, is 1 Kings.
This is I love this one. 1 Kings 19, 3-6. While he himself went a day's journey into the desert, he came to a broom tree, sat down under it, and prayed that he might die.
This is Elijah.
This is Elijah. I'm sorry, Elijah. I have had enough, Lord, he said. Take my life. I am no better than any ancestors. Then he lay down under the tree and fell asleep. All at once, an angel touched him and said, get up and eat. He looked around, and there by his head was a cake of bread baked over hot coals and a jar of water. He ate and drank and then lay down again. Like, we have a God who gives him cake. Like, honestly, I just think it's awesome because cake is good, and I know God likes cake now. But I mean, how simple is that? Yes, he is compassionate to the point of knowing that he just wants him to eat and have a drink of water. I love this verse because I grew up with calling my mom from wherever I was and telling her I was sad or I was depressed or I was upset or my heart was broken. And she's like, Susan, you just got to go sit under a tree and eat something and then call me back. And I was like, thank you, Mom. I don't feel better. But it did. It actually would let me know I just have to take care of myself and God's there to take care of me. So that's where compassion is. Just remember, compassion is empathy plus action. It's a great little formula. It's so neat to think about it that way. It helps with me because I don't do it very well. So I have to think of it that way. But the last thing we're going to talk about is the word upset. And this is all Brian. I have nothing to do with this one.
Right. Upset. If I could take any word out of the English language, it would be this word. It is the biggest problem I have in my life on a daily basis. And that says a lot. That I'm blessed. Things are going pretty well, but that the word upset is my biggest problem. Upset is a problem because we don't know what it means. we have no idea what it means. I used to be told when I was a kid, if, you just be careful, you don't want to upset anybody.
What's that mean?
What does that even mean? What does that even mean? I don't understand. People probably said, oh no, I'm not angry, I'm just upset. That sounds angry to me. So let's talk about the definition of upset. To force out of the usual upright, level, or proper position. So if someone's upset, someone knocked them over. That's the definition. This is not an emotion. People say this word all of the time. They say, oh, I'm upset. It is not an emotion, right? It is not specific. There is no way we can know what this really means. Are you upset, Matt? Are you upset, sad? Do you have an upset stomach? Have you upset the apple cart? I don't know what upset means, and it is a problem when people try and use this. The word is not specific. By all definition, Terry here is upset because Terry the turtle is not in his proper and upright position. This is the only definition we can use for upset. Where am I now?
You're in the very end.
Okay. We have to be more specific about our emotions. Upset is a terrible word. We cannot use it any longer when we talk about our feelings. We have to find better words. And that's what we're going to work on through these next 8 weeks, is finding the right words, because upset is so terrible. It's one of our comfort words, but we're going to find a better way to do it. The other problem with upset, there's plenty of problems with upset, I'm telling you. You went, oh,
I know.
okay. Without specificity in our emotions, and people say this word, oh, I'm upset. Don't you feel like it kind of leaves you set up? See what we did there? We kind of like took one word. So upset leaves us set up for failure in relating with others, because no one is going to know what we're really needing. We can't help other people. There's no connection when we talk about the word upset. If you are upset, then you are set up for failure in relating with others. In closing, Paul tells us the story of his meeting Jesus, not because it is a story to tell, but because it changed his life. He met Jesus, and it created a personal relationship with him. Paul was not given a message or a doctrine. He didn't witness Jesus preaching to the best of our knowledge. This message becomes a part of Paul because of the personal relationship with Jesus. We need this personal and emotional relationship with Jesus.
So Jesus, and this was in a devotional bit from Oswald Chambers, and I thought it fit perfectly with what we were talking about tonight, because it just kind of pulled it home. And when I read it to Brian, he's like, that goes at the end. So, and Jesus instructed his apostles to not tell about their mountaintop experience in witnessing the transfiguration. And I always was like, why? And why? He stated that they could tell after he had risen from the dead. If all they, if all they did was tell a story about the emotion, then it is just a story. When you tell a story, if it does not include an emotional context, then there's no emotional connection. The same with how we talk about Christ. So we all have been on the mountaintop, but if we've been on one or two mountaintops, that means we've been over in a valley. And it's easy to talk about it on the mountaintop, but it's really hard to talk about it in the valley. And so we've got to take that and hold it close to us. So when we get to that valley, that emotional connection is still there, even though the story is gone, because we're down in the valley. So this is why nobody cares about the sandwich that you made your kids. And if you posted a sandwich on Facebook, I apologize, but nope, I used to do it. So all the stuff you post on Facebook, if the sandwich you posted, the food you made, anything that you did, whatever you posted, it's a story, and it's good. It helps people kind of lightheartedly think of different things or know what kind of sandwich to make the next day. But don't make Jesus just a story. That's our whole point, is to be emotional, and that will keep it from going away.
So here's our contact information. You can write that down. I am brian.duncan@dacounseling.com. And then Susan is susan.duncan dacounseling.com. You can also post questions on CCB. We can answer questions as a group and process through some of those things. You can join the group there, and I'll post some information there as well. At this point, go ahead.
We're pretty much done. This was a very teaching, and I kind of see everybody, and I want to like hear what everybody thinks and what they say, and I love seeing the heads nod because I'm like, are we, does it make sense? Is it clicking, or does someone have something different that they want to add? If you want to add something and you want us to talk about it, we'll probably talk about the stuff that we hear. If y'all do want us to say something and you don't want to say it, we'll kind of share it, some ideas and thoughts on emotions at the beginning of each class. But from here on out, it's going to be pretty discussion oriented, we're hoping. We can talk and talk and talk. So if you don't want to talk, we can keep talking. But we would love to have the discussion because I think we learn from everybody and each other learns from the other. And it's such a good time to connect and talk because none of us are together. So it would be really neat to hear and be a part.
So does anybody have, if somebody needs to leave or whatnot, we understand, but because we're a little over our time, but does anybody have any questions that maybe we can talk about right now? We'll be willing to do that.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
I can't hear you, Sean.
I can't hear you, Sean.
How about that?
Yeah, I
There,
gotcha.
yay, hi.
Hallelujah. So, when you guys were talking about, the emotions connect us to the heart of God, and, just thinking about emotions and thinking throughout multiple stories, especially in the Old Testament, a word that came to mind is just intensity, and how God, just wondering, and I just wondered sometimes as you guys were starting this out, it's almost like intense emotions are dangerous or bad and no bueno. And so I wonder if there's just maybe a little bit of teaching maybe later on, or you guys have just how do we organize that in our heart, in our mind, when we have the intensity of emotions, and when is that okay, and maybe is there a line where it's not okay?
Right, like the window, yeah. And I always go back and forth with, shouldn't I kind of say out there, there's a window of too much emotion and not enough, that there's a window of the correct amount for each person. But yeah, I think the intensity of the Old Testament kind of helps create that. I don't want to have, that's a lot. So.
And I take a little bit of a different tack on that. I think all emotion is great. It's fantastic. If you're having it, I want to hear about it. I wish that I was good at it. Like I'm good at it from like sitting in my comfy chair while someone else is sitting on a comfy couch. Like I'm good at talking about it theoretically, and I struggle with it personally. And I want to be great at it because I think all emotion is fantastic. And sometimes that too much just means we're not knowing where to put it. And so part of the biggest problem is I think we displace, we're not using the right one at the right time. And so when we find a better way to understand what's happening for ourselves, when we understand what's happening for God, if you want to, we can think about the intensity of what God's saying. Again, he's coming in the Old Testament from a righteous place, that yeah, he's a little frustrated. Like, seriously, I gave you a great garden. Like, man, like, I think he's disappointed, and he's allowed to be because we've messed up. But that does not take away from the fact that he can't still be pleased in us, that he doesn't crave us. He is jealous for us. That is beautiful. He wants me.
But that it also would, because we're doing an emotional God, when we think of, can we be too emotional with God? Like, that's kind of, and that's where if we use him to go back to, he just wants us however we are. And so I think that actually kind of falls with Brian's. I'm a little bit more like, I'm a little more guarded and careful, and I got a window and I have to learn how to be in and out of them. And others, y'all might kind of be similar or more like Brian. But the interesting part is I'm better at feelings than him.
Yeah.
He's not as good at
Not very
them.
good.
But it's about what kind of emotion can you have with God or Jesus? Like, that's where you're supposed to go with your emotions. So can you be overly emotional with God or Jesus? I don't think so. But with my neighbor,
Yeah.
probably.
Too much information.
So, but that's a really good way to bring that up. I like that. I didn't think about actually, and then with the Old Testament
Yeah.
too, but that's pretty cool.
We answered your question.
Or discussed it. That's a good.
Absolutely. I just had one statement. Yeah, I have of course a favorite phrase. All behavior makes sense in context, and so just as you guys are talking, started that, is you could almost replace that as all emotions make sense in context.
Mhm.
And so I just really resonated with that, and it's good to remind myself as we're walking through this to be very aware of that as we're putting things in context.
Right.
Mhm.
And what we're going to do next week is pretty fun. We're going to introduce a tool that I've developed that helps everyone get emotions. There probably a lot of you think, oh my gosh, emotions, they're so complex. Yes and no. And so we're going to figure this out, and you're going to be like, oh, okay, that makes sense.
But they'll all be tied into God and
Right.
our relationship with Christ, not just how to be emotional with each other. Because honestly, it doesn't matter if I learn how to be emotional with Brian if I'm not able to be emotional with God, because you're always going to miss that ability to be the way you're supposed to be with him. So it's the emotions that we're going to teach, and working in the Bible and using different experiences in the Bible in areas to where it role models that and shows. Because that's kind of what I go back to. I'm like, okay, if I can do it with God, I'm okay. But then you take it from there and hope that he goes with you when you use him with other people. Because it's scary. Emotions are scary.
Mhm.
It's
Scary is
Yeah.
an emotion.
it is an emotion.
Any other questions or comments for tonight? Go ahead, Kevin.
Brian and Susan, I just wanted to thank y'all for all the preparation and prayer y'all put into developing this, and then doing it again the next 3.5 or 4 weeks, but when you were going to roll it out electronically instead of face to face. So you've done double the preparation, and it shows how God's using this. Timely. It was a topic y'all picked way before you probably even heard of COVID-19. You thought about it being in America. So thank y'all. Appreciate it.
Yeah,
Appreciate it.
thanks for
Thank you.
saying that. I think it is good timing. I think it's a godly timing thing, maybe. So
Yeah.
if any time to think about emotions, people are experiencing them. So maybe it'll kind of trigger and connect it for people.
But just like at the marriage retreat, you're finding deep topics to find a 3-word phrase that we could remember. And of course, the first one is go vertical, not horizontal. So that's a good base one that we can keep using. But compassion really isn't compassion unless you're doing something about it. The empathy plus the action. I think a lot of us have a lot of empathy, and we like to sit here in our nice, comfy kitchen chair, but we don't do the act part, which might even be just a text or a call or something that simple, but there is some action to it. And then the third thing that really touched me right there at the end, Susan, when you talked about how we have different emotion with our neighbor, meaning our next door neighbor or our neighbor at the grocery store or whatever, than with our own family. And
Right.
sometimes our emotions are more raw with our family because we do feel more comfortable there. But for me, who's not into my emotions too well, that's where I'm most uncomfortable, is the raw emotion. So anything that y'all can bring out in the next 7 weeks on, certainly we want to get more emotional with God. So that's a huge first principle, which would probably help with our emotion within our family walls of our house, you know.
Most definitely right now, because there's a lot of walls right now, huh?
And that 24/7, you know, used to be a joke from a retired neighbor when we first moved here. She was in her 80s and she told Jan, now 24/7 is just too much some days. I'll just tell you, y'all, you just get ready for when he retire, y'all retire someday. Well, now we're getting a little taste of it early. Early. And bless her heart, two weeks before she brought that comment up. And that was after she took one of y'all devotional writers on a Friday, wrote about taking time away from the house, go outside, go on a car drive. She went on a car drive within minutes, I think, of reading that and was gone about 2 hours.
Well, thanks for saying that.
Thanks, Kevin.
That was nice.
Yeah, and Jan was listening the whole time too, but she just didn't want to be seen on video tonight.
Well, that's okay.
Great.
I think this is a really good opportunity too with our kids because we are all in the same house.
Oh, yeah.
I think sometimes, you know, adults are worried about their jobs and they're worried about homeschooling now and all these things. But I think sometimes we kind of slight the kids who feel the emotions of the parents. And I think that's one of the biggest things I've heard from my school students, not our kids, but the kids that I teach math to, is that they feel the tension in the house. And it's interesting that they bring that up when I'm talking to them about math.
Right.
They feel the tension in their own house because of their parents. And I'm sure that families across our church are feeling that too. Those kids are. And so being able to like, can you name how you're feeling instead of just pushing it under the rug, trying to get through another day with them?
Right. Yeah. It actually gets so much smaller if you can just use the emotions and say what they are, just say that you're having them, if you can describe them. It might not change how much you feel, but it changes your knowledge of what you feel. And then you can work from there. That was just like the whole thing at Sonic. I just start going off on my kids, like mad that we're at Sonic. And I'm sitting there going, but you're the reason we're here. Why'd you say yes? And then I'm just like, I had to sit and think. And I'm like, I'm just scared. And that's good for them to see too. And I mean, I don't know, but James is like, I go, well, I just ruined your ability to ever ask me if I'm mad again. He's like, it took 30 minutes to get the guts up, Mom. So, but honestly, it's what you do with it afterwards, you know, to clean it up that actually matters. So, but yeah, so I can imagine it's tense in it's got to be tense in every home at their own level. So,
Right.
Yeah.
Any other questions or comments? Well, great. Well, ooh, somebody moving there.
It's so hard because we can't see everybody. There.
Yeah, great first class.
Yeah, I
Looking
can't wait.
forward to next week. Is that what you were
Yeah, I was
gonna
gonna say, can't wait until next week. This is really good for me because I'm not in touch with my emotions at all. Sometimes I feel something and Sarah wants me to talk about it, but I don't even have the words. I don't even know. It takes me a while to actually put a word to the emotion that I feel. So this is helpful, and it is also helpful because I grew up in an environment, spiritual environment, where emotions were looked upon in a very skeptical way, and were not really encouraged at all. And so to be able to come from both directions, I think is going to be very helpful for me spiritually, and also just in being able to put words in what my feelings are as well, and to be able to realize that this is something that God values and created in me is going to really help that process. So I appreciate it. Look forward to next week.
Yes.
Sure. We're glad. You're all going to find, if you're someone who doesn't, like I'm the one who grew up without really learning emotions. It was more just reacting all the time. I grabbed on to the feelings and I grabbed on to the definitions of them. And Brian kind of grew up and he, you know, works with it so much, but he just kind of has it in his head and knows it. But for me, not having it, I grabbed it and I was like, this is my map and it helps me understand. And so usually the people like for Kelly, I think you'll really like it. I think you'll go, oh, so that's a word I can use. And
Mhm.
so we have clients walk in with this feeling grid and they're like, okay, this is my feeling right here. And then we talk like it's kind of a security, and it helps you understand where you're coming from. But
Right.
it's hard to talk feelings if you didn't grow up with them. It's also hard to talk Spanish if you didn't grow up speaking it. You know, it's the same kind of thing to me. So
Go ahead.
Ryan, you
Yeah.
can relate to Kelly and I better the more football examples you can come up with during
Okay.
well, we're
Well-
actually going to
well,
use
those emotions we can start with. Maybe we can build from there.
See, I grew up watching movies, so there's no crying in baseball. But then if you watch Field of Dreams, like, how do you not? So I don't know. I'm really confused. But no, we're really going to lay it out.
Yeah.
Again, when next week is going to be a lot of, I think, some self-exploration stuff. And when we get to understand ourselves a little bit and how to use these feelings, we get to then, as we dive into actual feelings that God's using, we can understand how that relates with us. It's really going to clear up a lot of things. So, and we start off with basics. So you can speak like caveman, I feel sad. So, and you can't use hungry. Hungry's not a feeling.
That's a feeling.
Right.
That's a big feeling.
No, it's
But
not.
now we can eat cake. We
Right,
eat
cake.
all the time.
Jesus, God will provide. Thank you all very much. I'm going to
Yeah.
pray and before sending you guys back to your families and evenings. So thank you all so much again for being here.
Okay, good.
Heavenly Father, thank you so much for making us in your image, giving us the opportunity to be emotional. Lord, we want to learn through this experience and opportunity how we can connect with you the way that you have tried for ages to connect with us, to touch our hearts and to motivate us into being compassionate with others the same way that Jesus is with us. So thank you, Lord, for these opportunities, for these great peoples in this future conversation that we're going to have. In your heavenly and blessed name, amen.
Amen. All right. We'll see
Thank
y'all
y'all
next
very
week.
much. See you
It was
next week, 7 o'clock.
So great seeing faces from
Yes.
church.
There's a good one, Kelly.
Yeah.
Invite your friends, invite others, have them come and join us. And I'll let on CCB post the recorded version of this event. Thank you all.
All right. Bye.
Thanks.